It's just one of those days. Get ready for Liberalist blood sports. Greetings and welcome to Centrist Blood Sports. Today in the virtual Thunderdome, we're going to be spitting venom in regards to gun control. On the fore side of the octagon, we have Holger and Elziad. Cool names, guys. On the against side, ready to smash a blunt object into their spinal column, we have Cody and Sean Mannix. Get ready to get wrecked. So, Cody, give us your introduction.
Hi, I'm Cody. I live in Australia, and as everyone knows how amazing quote-unquote Australian gun laws are, I don't like it. So I am for guns. I'm against gun control. Not that I'm against any regulations at all. I do believe there needs to be some rules, but we don't need stringent rules that take away everyone's guns. That is ridiculous. Anyway, I live in Australia. I've had a few experiences with guns, very limited though. I've shot guns when I was in cadets, and I've shot guns when I was in Vietnam. Very fun experience. I recommend everyone do it.
So by in Vietnam, you mean you were serving in the military in the 70s?
No. I was on holiday in Vietnam last year.
I think you should just tell people you were in Vietnam. I think that's a great one. Just like some 21-year-old guy going, yeah, back in Nam. Just call it Nam. All right, next up, we have Elziad. Give us your introduction.
Hey there, I'm Elziad. I'm from the UK. My perspective on guns is in large part from 5 years in the cadets when I was at school. So I had a bit of experience with semi-automatic and bolt-action target shooting through that, to the point where I actually dropped PE to take target shooting instead. Basically, my take on gun control comes from the perspective of trying to reduce the massacres that occur. And I'll clarify that. A massacre is defined from the source I found as 4+ dead in one incident, which distinguishes it from a mass shooting. So I prefer to focus on the massacres because, well, they happen a lot more with guns than anything else. So yeah, that's my ramble.
Cool. Sean, what do you got for us? Hello? Sean. Oh.
Howdy. Sorry. My name is Sean Mannix. I did some time in the Marine Corps. I shoot occasionally competitively. I occasionally write under pseudonym about guns and a wilderness survival, actually. And in general, I would say I'm very pro-Second Amendment. I believe very much so in the idea of self-defense as a human right. Locke himself points this out as far as the law of, the nature of war, it's a very much so part of human rights. I think it's a natural right of self-defense. And I feel like modern firearms are simply just a tool that extends that. There's a lot of negatives that I understand as far as massacres and things like that. However, massacres are not, just from firearms. I think we need to look at other issues besides just the gun as a tool for massacres, because in itself, it's still the best way for a single individual to defend themselves.
Right. So where are you from, Sean?
Currently, I'm in Olympia, Washington, and I'm an actual Evergreen graduate.
Oh, nice. So, Holger, your introduction.
Yeah, hi. I'm Holger Dane. As my name suggests, I'm Danish. And I'm sure that in the United States you hear much too much about Denmark in terms of politics, because you have some left-wing politicians who like to hold Denmark up as the, I don't even know, Garden of Eden or something. And if we just do everything like it's done here, then it's going to be great. Well, honestly, some of your left-leaning politicians don't really, they have an idea, they don't know why it works, They just think, oh yeah, that's great, let's have that. And well, you know, you want to have a pie, you gotta actually make it. You can't just go out and buy a pie. Well, you could today, but in terms of nations, there's no ready-made set that you can just plop down in your nation and you get something. In terms of firearms, this means that we actually have in some areas we have less gun control than the United States, and in some areas we have more. And I'd like to talk about that. We don't have very many massacres. Obviously, it's a very small nation. But even so, from the problems we do have, it's pretty clear to me why the gun control we have makes it so that it's illegal weapons that are part of massacres when they happen here, or mass shootings when they happen here, and not legal weapons. And I think the law has a role or a part to play in terms of creating a positive culture around guns, so that the right people can have guns, but antisocial people generally can't. And that's sort of the direction I'd like to try to have the conversation go.
All right. With that in mind, I'll ask the first question of, let's say, Sean. What's your best case against gun control?
History in itself. At the end of the day, any government is made up of its people. The lowest unit of governance is the individual. Thus, a government that respects an individual respects the natural rights of an individual. I think that's a very Locke principle of governance. We need to understand that. And any government that has not, often we do see things like, I don't like to get into the meme of massacres and things like that, but hyper-controlled states are often not a healthy society. That doesn't mean you can't have good policy, which we can always get into. But I do believe that any single authoritarian regime that is fully armed and the people are not, it's always a one-way battle, and that is not a healthy society.
All right. Well, Elziad, is owning guns a human right?
You see, on an ideological point, I do understand, and I do want to agree that, yes, technically you should have the right to own anything you want. But at the same time, everybody draws a line on this. Like, you wouldn't say that it would be reasonable to have every citizen allowed to own an artillery piece, allowed to own high explosives. There is a line drawn at some point. And I personally draw that line more on the side of handheld physical weapons, like a knife or an axe or something that we're allowed to own, rather than a gun. That's basically my take on it.
Cody, what do you think about that? Is that a fair line to draw? You know, gun or knives or axes or things like that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree that there needs to be a line drawn, but I'm on the opposite end of the spectrum, and I think the line should be drawn after all small arms. So anything that can be carried, I think, yes, a citizen should be able to carry it as part of a militia. Anything that can be carried up to the point of bazookas and rocket launchers and grenade launchers, high explosive stuff like that, that's for the purview of the military. So, because that's... Sorry?
No, keep going. I didn't know you were... Sorry. Sean, where would you draw that line?
Small arms, absolutely small arms. And the reason is, and I think objectivists, like the super hyper libertarian objectivists, Ayn Rand fans would agree, that in general the state does get to have a monopoly of violence to have a functioning state, but it can't be a true monopoly. That's not actually respectful of the people. And I would also point out that we actually do give the individuals the rights for greater arms, but we don't consider it because we don't see it as the individual choice. But because of the fact we do vote, we do hold elections in most modern democracies, we choose to elect individuals with access to nuclear arsenals and the policy to enforce it on our behalf. So in that idea of self-defense and as far as scale, when it comes to if the group is threatened, right? That idea of the collective individuals, we do actually have the ability to go to war, right? That's what a healthy government does in our half. Like government's main goal is security of its people. Like first and foremost, that's one of the main functions of government. However, the individual, again, is the lowest level of government. Therefore, firearms definitely hold a place as they are the most efficient tool currently available for an individual self-defense. It is the leveling playing field between an 80-year-old grandmother and a man my size, and I'm a fairly large man. Okay, that's why firearms should always be able to be in private hands, because the idea of axes, knives, or whatever, those are physical weapons that are from an age in which brutality and sheer physical strength mattered more. We should use technology and always leverage technology, and it's foolish to think we should not. So the idea that firearms somehow should not be in the hands of individuals, I think, is anachronistic thinking, and it's not healthy.
All right, so could you define small arms for me, please?
Man portable. And if you, we could dig into some policy, but the Federalist Papers pretty much summed it up. The musket of their era, the powder load of the militia was the military arm of their era and their day. That would be something similar to an M4 today. Now, I'm not even saying you should have a full auto M4. I'm not even entirely anti-NFA, which will draw me ire on the a lot of pro-gun crowds, because I understand that full automatic fire squad weapons generally don't have a self-defense purpose, unless your position is being overrun by the Zerg rush, right? That's not something that the average individual would need. But for a home defense, an AR-15 is completely reasonable. In fact, it's one of the best possible tools we have currently available with our technology. Therefore, it belongs in the hands of the individual.
Holger, any thoughts?
Yeah, we're talking about what individuals should have, and I generally have the perspective that for home defense purposes, a pump action shotgun is probably sufficient, like for most people at least. But beyond that, I don't have anything against the AR-15 in terms of being owned by private citizens. The question is, who should get to have them, not should someone get to have them. And what I mean by that is, if you think about incarcerated prisoners, we don't generally allow those to carry guns while they're incarcerated. And that's in spite of the fact that they are not necessarily violent. And, you know, prison rape is a thing. It would probably be pretty nice if you were some, swindler or something like that, to have a handgun so that you could defend yourself against something like that. But we don't allow it because it's too risky to allow private citizens while they're incarcerated, that kind of thing. Similarly, I think that we could have a way of saying, well, you need to be safe to have a gun. And obviously that introduces a whole host of issues, because the government can't be the one that determines whether or not you're safe to own a firearm. That's not tenable, because that risks authoritarianism really quickly. But it is possible, I would argue, to have a policy where you can have people that can determine whether or not you should have access to your firearms that are not the government. And the way to think about that is, suppose you have a lot of friends who carry firearms, and suppose you start to deteriorate mentally, you contract Alzheimer's or something like that, and you have pretty severe PTSD. Should your friends be able to then say, someone, look, this guy is dangerous to himself and to others? And in that circumstance, I believe the answer is pretty clearly yes. So the idea that your friends, perhaps even your family, should have some influence over the type of firearm that you might have seems workable. The question is, can we translate that into policy? And well, I think you can, and I think we have done so in Denmark, in terms of, before you get to store a firearm in your own home, you have to have, at least if you're getting it on a range shooting license, you have to have used a ranged firearm that was local to the range for a period. I believe it's 2 years. And then after that, after you've gotten to know people at the range, after you've gotten to know, this is in the law, after you've gotten to know the owner of the range, and he says, okay, this guy, I actually believe it's okay for him to own a firearm. Then he gets to purchase a firearm and store it in his home safely. So that's sort of how I look at it. Not in terms of this is legal, this shouldn't be, but in terms of who should be allowed to have a firearm at home.
All right. So, Cody, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, that's entirely my perspective of gun control, is that the question shouldn't be whether or not people are allowed to have guns or not. The answer to that question is absolutely yes. The question of who should get a gun is the one that I am more nuanced, and that's where the nuance can come in. Because I believe that there should be gun licenses issued by a government that in order to get a license you should go through a safety course, or 6 hours or so going through gun safety, storage, whatnot. You know that. Because that's common sense to me. But
well, the problem
there
is
should absolutely be background checks and all that.
Yeah, but the problem here is who decides. And I believe that Holger had a nice suggestion there of a community deciding for themselves. What did you think about that suggestion, Elziad?
I thought it was actually a really good idea. It's not one I had ever considered prior to talking to Holger. It's a novel idea, getting, like, I think Holger mentioned, getting everybody together. So as a community, they'll maybe have barbecue events once a month or something, or maybe even more often. And so that they are interacting constantly. And if somebody withdraws from that community, it's then the community's responsibility to ensure that they are still safe to own a gun or take the gun off them. And that definitely would have reduced a lot of mass shootings, but certainly the ones I'm aware of. There's a vastly, like an overwhelming majority of them tend to be people who have secluded themselves from society and from social enterprises. So I suspect it would be highly effective in that front.
All right, so Sean,
the biggest problem with that,
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
I see is that in neighborhoods that aren't very good communities, in the ghettos, of the inner cities in America, in the not so good, I'm doing air quotes at the moment, good places in the suburbs and neighborhoods and all that, where there's very little trust of anyone. You have the problem of if everyone goes and marks and does a black mark against everyone's neighbor, then who does the government or the enforcement of this policy know who to do? Who's actually being genuine and who just wants to take guns from the other people?
That's a good problem. Do you have an answer for that, Holger?
Yeah. Obviously, you can't have it so that your neighbor determines whether or not you have a weapon. That doesn't work. It has to be. I actually thought of this as a three-tier system. I thought of it as hunting firearms, range firearms, and militia firearms, because I believe like something like an AR-15 would be a militia firearm, whereas a hunting firearm might be something like a big ball revolver if you're in Alaska and you have to worry about bears, or the rest of the time it could be some type of lever action or bolt action rifle. So you would start out as a hunter, gaining access to that, and you would do that by joining some sort of organization where there are hunters in it. And if you integrate well with that organization, then instead of borrowing a weapon or a firearm when you go on hunts, you can then own one. So that's how I would do it. You have to join a sanctioned organization, and these organizations would then fall into three categories: hunting organizations, range organizations, and militia organizations. And I think that's how you solve it. So it's not your immediate neighbor. It's that you have to positively integrate into some kind of community. And that community would then, because we know hunters, we know people who go to the range, if somebody, doesn't have trigger discipline at the range, right? You don't trust that guy. There's all of these rules that you have to start to learn when you go there. You have to learn how to clean your gun. You have to learn, where to point it, how to work it, how to disassemble it, how to put it back together. Through that process, you have the opportunity to really sort of evaluate the person doing it, if that's a requirement. And if you know that whether or not this person gets a gun depends on that you're actually responsible for making sure that he can be trusted, then you're going to take that pretty seriously, and you might even ask him serious questions. And that's good, because we want something to stop the massacres, right? We want something to stand in the way and be responsible for saying, no, we won't take this. And if the way we do it is via private citizens, then you have something that's much more reliable than if the government does it. At least that's how I see it.
Sean, do you see any problems coming up with Holger's policy suggestion?
Okay, so in general, one, I appreciate that it actually is becoming more of a policy discussion instead of a thou shalt nots. I find that is a little bit more refreshing than the standard debate I have to engage in with things like this. One, on things like, as far as classifications of weapons, right? And ARs as militia weapons. I occasionally train new shooters, and I would say occasionally is kind of an understatement. I have trained a 5'4" woman to shoot, and on more than one occasion, and watching a small-statured woman try to move and operate a combat 12-gauge shotgun for self-defense is quite possibly one of the most comical things and dangerous I can do on a range, especially with defensive loads. That's where choice, I think, really matters, and fitting firearms to application and people. I don't always believe a one-size-fit-all approach to things like that. Like you said, if you feel comfortable defending yourself with a shotgun, I'm one of those people I think, okay, good on you. I will say, though, that most small-statured people handle submachine guns and AR-15s incredibly well. And it makes them the single best option for them. And so for that, I don't like the idea of it being pulled out of a classification where it is steps for a woman leaving a bad situation to get something she could use to defend her life. I cite on the individual always, unless the individual is proven, and I think that's where policy should be focused. If an individual is proven to be unfit, I think that's a very separate policy discussion. And that's one that I think there might be more to be done, and maybe, that's, I think, much more open to discussion. But the idea that a small-statured woman has to wait possibly years when she could be under imminent threat, like moved across a country, right? Like if known threats, and the state isn't always going to be there, right? We can't let individual bodyguards don't get appointed unless you're a government official. So for that individual, I am always abhorrent of a system that would take that individual's ability to defend themselves. And then things like with an AR, unfortunately, that is the best tool currently available. Again, eventually we might get something cooler. We might get automatic, like Splinter Cell level stun guns, right? But we're not there yet. So currently, ballistic defensive methods are incredibly useful. Low recoil semi-automatic firearms are incredibly useful because the average person can shoot them very well.
So Sean,
so that's where I kind of draw a line as far as that.
Sean, do you feel like Holger's suggestion would do anything to mitigate the effects of these quote-unquote mass shooting incidences, or is that a red herring?
Well, okay, so I have to be careful because I actually studied criminology. That was kind of major. When we look at like the Aussie gun ban and others, what's unfortunate is if you look at the actual homicide firearm rate in Australia, it actually hasn't really moved. It was incredibly low before. Violent crime in Australia was actually going down starting in 1993. And same with the United States. That was kind of our peak year, and then it started going down and down. And we've only got 2 years where it's spiking recently. Mass shootings are actually rare. And I would point out that and we could get into the weeds of this a bit, but the psychology of mass killers, there's not a huge nomothetic outline for these people outside of usually narcissism. There's very few actually in common, but as far as most of them are individual, they have as many individual motives as most criminals, unfortunately. So there isn't like one type, one place. You'll get a guy running, you'll do the Nice truck attack, you're going to get Paris, and that's with incredible gun restrictions. People who are motivated to that level of violence, again, it's statistically rare in the West, which is, we're very lucky with that. But those people are going to find a way. That's what Nice should have told people. I don't think people understood that some of those folks are just maybe maladapted. You know, like there's a lot of psychology we could figure out. Again, and even worse is these individuals often are not cookie cutter, right? There isn't a nomothetic profile. There just isn't yet. We do know that with a lot of the single shooters, non-terrorist link, if there's high narcissism in most of them. Other than that, they have as many motives and reasons to do what they do as, unfortunately, many other criminals. So means, again, I would say that's a means thing, right? We could remove some firearms, but people of that caliber of violence are going to find other means. And so I'm not entirely sure we're dealing with a mass casualty issue in the same way. Nor are we really dealing with something like gang violence in the same way. I guess that's my point. Right.
So, Cameron, do you have any response to what was just said?
Well, yeah, the whole thing about the Nice truck attack was part of the reason it was so devastating is that we hadn't really seen anything quite like it before, or at least not to that extent. Basically, if I go down to this town centre here, certainly around like the Fringe Festival time, I'm in Edinburgh, and there will be these giant yellow barricades across the roads now to prevent pedestrian areas from being attacked by large vehicles. So yes, they found a way that time, but we've taken safeguards against that moving forward, and that's part of the thing. In the UK, we've had 6 massacres in the last 22 years. The first of those was a school shooting with a handgun. A year later, we banned handguns across the UK. 2010, we had a .22 rifle shooting spree somewhere in England. And other than that, the other 4 were 2 bombings and 2 car attacks. Both the car attacks were supplemented by the terrorists getting out with knives to do a bit more damage because cars aren't actually that effective. So realistically, the only one which would have... Sorry, I'll go back a second. Meanwhile, from a bit of research I did, in 2016 alone, there were 28 separate instances in the USA where 4 or more people were killed in a single instance, which was gun-related only. That's not involving... I don't know if you guys actually had car bombings in 2016, but the point is, you had like 6 times, no, more than that, many times more massacres in 2016 than the UK has had in 22 years. And...
Okay, we'll move on.
Sorry.
Do you mind if I jump in here for just a second?
Oh, okay.
Okay, so your population in the UK is a fraction of that of the United States. And you've actually had some fairly large-scale terrorist attacks with incredible injury numbers as well. I would say we have to be careful when we use mathematics, right, and statistics when we're dealing with things like an individual right. And the reason is I hate to say this, I'm one of those people that I don't care about your dead children, not because I don't care about dead children, but because the right of the individual still is going to override a lot of grisly math, I'd say, at the end of the day.
I appreciate that. And the issue is, well, part of it is magazine size. I really like guns. As I said, I did some shooting when I was younger. And personally, I'd be in favor of having legal ranges that I could go to and just blow off some steam. Fully automatic. I would love to have a fully automatic 50 caliber machine gun I could just blast away on the range with. But the trouble is, when it comes to force multiplying weapons, I wouldn't want something with that level of force multiplication commonly in the hands of the people, because there's the argument from protecting against the state, as I think it was briefly brought up, I think possibly by Cody earlier. If having some small arms isn't reliably going to defend you against the state, because the state has vastly superior firepower.
Move on to Cody. Cody, what do you got?
Thought there, sorry.
All right. Okay. With that, what you just said, that last moment, that small arms not being able to defend you against the state, I have one very quick thing to say. Vietnamese rice farmers.
Was that from your time in Nam?
Yes. The idea that having small arms is nothing compared to what the United States government has with the military it's bonkers. It's a guerrilla war can very, very easily wear down a superior power. It has happened in history so many times, in Vietnam, Afghanistan, in Iraq, I'm trying to think of other examples. The Romans had struggled with it in some areas. Any citizens that have small arms, who know their own home, know where they live, they will definitely be able to, if not absolutely just ruin the quote-unquote larger power, but to extremely strain them.
So, Holger, is that a fair criticism, that the having small arms will not defend against a military with superior might?
I'm reminded that my own nation was under military occupation during the Second World War, and well, the British certainly thought that us having some small arms was going to be useful, because they dropped down some for us, and yeah, they were useful. Unfortunately, the main way they're useful when you're under authoritarian control is for it's not very pleasant. It's for executing snitches. So I would wager that small arms were primarily used on Danes by other Danes, because yeah, you gotta you gotta make sure that when the Nazis say we're gonna kill 10 of you, if there's a sabotage of the railways, then you're willing to kill the snitches, and you're perhaps even willing to kill their families, because otherwise you're gonna get snitched on when you do sabotages. And so, yeah, small arms do have a role to play, especially submachine guns, because they're really good for executions. But it's when you're occupied, you're primarily your primary weapon is that people can't tell you from the civilian population, and that sounds, it sounds rough, right? But that's how that works. I would say that that the idea of having an armed militia kind of takes care of the capacity for tyranny to to play a part in this conversation, because so long as you say no, we're allowing for a militia that has
about 20 seconds
effective weapons, right? If we're allowing that, then I think that's enough. You can limit ordinary citizens that aren't part of the militia, and then that will work.
So, Elziad, we're going to go back to policy here. Now, who gets to own a weapon in your eyes, and where do you draw that line?
Well, funnily enough, I favor Holger's side of things, which seems to be based on you don't get to have a weapon until you've proven you're responsible enough to own it, rather than the position of you get to have it until you've proven you're not responsible to own it. Because unfortunately, proving you're not responsible can take some rather dramatic examples. Generally speaking, I think the idea of a militia type system or a scaled system whereby a hunter gets it and like you gradually scale it up as well. Like the hunter might be able to have a pistol at home as well for home defense, somebody who's got the hunter level, but or an AR-15. But I would personally want that restricted in magazine size, ideally to 5 rounds, possibly to 10. Because truth be told, if somebody's broken into your house at night, the odds are the moment you start shooting, they're going to turn tail and run. Human psychology, we don't like getting shot at, especially if we weren't expecting it. So I don't see that needing a 30-round magazine is necessarily a thing.
Okay, so Cody, Elziad says people need to prove they can own a weapon. I get the feeling you may feel almost opposite of that.
Actually, no. I agree. I absolutely agree that people should be responsible and all that. But I imagine that between Elziad and I, what we class as responsible when it comes to who can own a weapon is very different. So
Right.
I think most people should, like, just walking down the street, most people you see, I'd assume that most of them would be responsible enough to own a weapon. And because it's a very small number of people who are actually the scum who will go out and murder people. There's only a small number of them.
Well, Cody, first I have to push back a little bit because you said earlier that owning a weapon is a right. But if you determine that it's simply like a statement of people are guilty of not being able to own a weapon until they're proven innocent, wouldn't that be incoherent to what you previously said about it being a right?
I didn't say it was a right. That was I think that was someone else. I said I can't remember what I said. I'm just gonna say I'll say that it is a right to defend yourself and we shouldn't be limited to melee weapons like knives or something like that. Guns and all that absolutely should play a part. But in that, I don't think it should be legislated, but I think people should definitely be responsible. Responsibility is the big thing when it comes to the individual citizens. Because I can't remember the exact saying, my rights end where your responsibility begins, or something along those lines. It's that your right to self-defense is your responsibility not to go out and attack people. That's the entire idea.
All right, then. Holger, now you said earlier that you would base it on sort of social groups to determine who is allowed and who's not allowed to have a gun. Now, you stated your three-tier system, but exactly how would you stop someone from falsely reporting someone as unable to have a gun?
Well, reporting someone, that's interesting. You know, the way I think about it is, right, let's be really concrete. Right? You have someone like Anders Breivik. He had a Ruger Mini 14, I believe it was, with a 30, like, I think he had 8 30-round magazines taped to his legs when he went on his massacre in Norway. And that firearm was, that's a semi-automatic rifle, and it's about as capable as an AR-15. I'm not sure it would have been in his case because he had equipped it with all sorts of monstrous looking gadgets And when I say monstrous, I mean they're legitimate gadgets. He just put on silly things on it because I don't know. He's obviously got a screw loose, but he managed to kill about 70 people with it. Right. So what I've been really racking my mind on is how the hell do you stop Anders Breivik from getting a weapon? Because the thing about him is he went to I believe Czechoslovakia. Well, that would be today. They're no longer Czechoslovakia, but
Czechia and Slovakia.
Yeah, one of those he went to. I can't remember which ones or which one. But he tried to acquire, he tried to buy an AK-47 because he thought that would be great. He actually, it seems he had a 10-year plan where he was going to earn a lot of money, and then he was going to get a lot of explosives, and he was going to get this assault rifle and all of this, right? He didn't manage to get the AK-47 though, so he didn't have a full auto firearm when he went on his spree. So how do you stop that from happening? Well, obviously you could say, well, Norway shouldn't allow semi-automatic rifles for hunting. Okay, well, the problem is you risk creating a black market, so suddenly he can get the weapon on the black market instead, right? And that's actually pretty bad, because on the black market he might be able to get a fully automatic weapon instead of just a semi-automatic one. So you might make things worse. At the end of the day, I don't have a good question on how on the question you asked, how you prevent someone from falsely reporting someone else. I would say that if you're part of a group of hunters, then they know you pretty well, and if someone tries to tell them that you're not, you got a screw loose or something, then they're gonna talk to you, and they're gonna figure out, is something wrong or not. Because I mean, if what you're doing is you're saying that there's a community that tries to take responsibility for whether or not you can have a firearm, that you have to know that are your friends, right? Then suppose that's Anders Breivik, and then they have a talk with him, and they find out something's wrong. Then it would be really good to take away his guns. Suppose it's a false report. Hopefully they talk to the person. And they figure out, no, he's actually it's just Jim. He's just fine. His neighbor is just being an asshole. Hopefully that's the way it would work out. But I mean, there's always going to be an element of trust. What I do know is Anders Breivik was able to have this really powerful firearm and not, be a part of any community whatsoever. And as far as I can tell, that's the only place you could have stopped him. So that's really my thinking on that.
Right. So I want to move over to the topic of arming teachers, which is it's been somewhat of a hot topic since Donald Trump once again. Though I do like the guy and his trolly nature, he usually does like to speak out of his keister. Now, Elziad, how do you feel about the arming teachers question?
See, it's an interesting one, in that I recoil originally from it because it sounds like a terrible idea, and I guarantee you that sooner or later one of those armed teachers is going to shoot a kid, or a kid's going to steal the teacher's gun, or something's going to happen if you arm the teachers. But at the same time, given the current climate and the current situation with how alarmingly often school shootings happen. Now, don't get me wrong, it's very rare and unlikely it's going to happen to your school, but how many has it been this year already? It's something ridiculous. It's in the teens, is it? Mm-hmm. For school shootings. Granted, most of them have been fairly minor, but
it's been 2.
Only 2 school shootings.
Yes, once it was fact-checked. It originally said 18 school shootings, but it turns out just about 16 of them were students killing themselves. A few of them were students killing themselves on property when the school was closed. Someone getting a stray bullet from a gang activity across the street, stuff like that. So literally this year there's been 2 such shooting events, and one of them where no student died, if I recall correctly.
Fair enough. I'll retract that then. Misinformed. But still, it's 2 in 2 months is still kind of alarmingly high. The idea that I wouldn't necessarily mind having certain teachers be, if they were, again, responsible, we knew they were responsible, part of the gun club, part of a community of gun owners. I'd like to think most teachers are responsible as well, just by the nature of their job, and you'd presumably do a bit of a background check when hiring them. If they were responsible and willing, that's the other thing. You can't force a gun into the hand of every teacher. That's not part of their job description.
All right,
But,
Sean, how do you feel about the whole arm the teachers question?
Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Okay, so this is a situation where, again, I go back to it's an individual right. I think that technically a teacher, any educator currently that's going through an American school system goes through an FBI background check and many other processes just to be a teacher. Okay. And the idea that somehow a teacher's right to self-defense, let's go back to that, disappears when they go to work is kind of silly to me, because it's not a government installation. It's not a courthouse. It's not one of these places. It's not an airport where we often just prohibit firearms carte blanche outside of the armed, deputies. I would say that you have plenty of military veterans, people who are trained, people are willing, and if they are willing to take that responsibility, they're willing to take the risks. That's the other thing too. It's a double-edged sword. If you do something wrong with a firearm, you go to jail for a long time. So I'm not opposed to the idea at all of a teacher carrying. If that's a risk they're willing to take, and that is something that they're willing to deal with the consequences, hell or high water, then let them do it. States like Utah already do it. Several others do, but Utah, if you look at school violence in Utah, well, and I'm not saying it's a one-to-one, but I would say it points out, we know from just a criminal profiling standpoint that mass killer, these people who do commit massacres do prefer soft targets, right? That is something we do know. You talk about putting up barriers with cars. Okay. Well, if you have to put up a barrier in front of a crowd to stop them from running into it, a ballistic barrier of a teacher who is armed is something that's going to hopefully deter a future shooter. And right now, there's not a lot of data either way because we don't have it widely implemented. But we do see, gun-free zones, unfortunately, turning into free fire zones only for people who are, demented enough and willing to commit violence.
Cody, what do you have for us?
The idea, sorry, the idea of the deterrent is the number one thing for me. That's exactly why teachers definitely should be allowed to be armed. I'm not saying that they have to be armed. If they don't want to, they don't have to. But they should be allowed to. The deterrent is a deterrent has stopped a global war in the past 70 years because of the nuclear threat. That deterrent has stopped war from occurring across the globe. If you take that down to the individual person level, in places you never see a mass shooting. You never see shootings at a gun show like the South Park episode. You never see shootings there. You see shootings at exactly where Sean said. You see shootings at the soft targets. You see, because I was on the radio the other day, I heard a woman was talking. This topic was on, and a teacher, I think she was a teacher called up and she said she definitely would have wanted a weapon if she said if there was gunshots going off down the hallway and I was in my room with all my kids that I'm teaching, I would definitely have loved to have had a gun, to have all my kids behind me, waiting behind a table for that bastard to walk in. That was exactly what she said. The idea that teachers shouldn't be allowed to defend the kids that they're looking after is abhorrent to me.
Holger, what do you have to say?
I think that there's absolutely, I mean, in a situation where there's a school shooting, I would want all of the teachers to be concealed carriers, legal or not, because I'd want the school shooter to be killed. The thing is, right, I don't think it's going to be a deterrent. And the reason is, I think that school shooters are like, Anders Breivik is a little bit of a special example. He wasn't suicidal, but for the most part, I think school shooters are committing suicide. The thing is, they're just killing a lot of people first. The recent Florida thing also seems to be a little bit weird, because that seems to be a really antisocial kid that didn't want to kill himself. But I think there's, among teenagers, I think there's, for every one person killed in a mass shooting, for every victim in a mass shooting, there's 20 young men killing themselves. So what you're looking at is really something like a suicide epidemic, where a few of these people, like 5 of these people, are so disagreeable and so hateful that they take other people out first. At least that's how I tend to look at it. And in those terms, I don't think it's going to be a deterrent, unfortunately. That doesn't mean they shouldn't be allowed to be armed. I'm honestly, if the parents trust them with it, if the other teachers trust the teachers to be responsible with a firearm near children, it's, I would put it to them that they have to make that choice. So I don't think it should necessarily be an individual choice. I think that everybody has to be okay with it. But if everybody locally is okay with it, why should I don't see my role as something to get involved in between there, right? So that I think that's my response to that.
Okay, we're going to move on to a question from the chat from Bethany Davis. Yes, we just doxed you. This is blood sports. Now, I'm going to hand this to Elziad here. Now, I assume you believe in property rights, and property rights would also include guns. Now, do you think a private citizen can sell another private citizen their property, being guns, legally? And how would you regulate that?
See, generally, yes, I agree with the principle that you should be able to sell anything that you own. But again, firearms being such a powerful force multiplier would have a special case related to them. I mean, ideally, in an ideal world, from my point of view, we'd have something similar to Holger's militia type thing, and they would, basically anybody who owned a gun store, a range, or hunting supplies and whatnot stores, they'd all be involved quite heavily in these militia type deals, top of the level. And ideally, I would make it that you'd only actually be able to sell a gun to those establishments, and then you'd be able to buy guns from them. It'd be kind of like WeBuyAnyCar.com, or a little plug there for them, in that you could guarantee that one of these establishments would buy your gun when you wanted to sell it. But it gets messy. I'm not going to deny it gets messy. It's hard to answer question about, actually, yeah.
Sean, do you have any response?
Okay. He's actually on to a good point, and I loathe to say that. You could sell your car. Okay. But just because you sell somebody your car doesn't mean they have the ability to drive it, right? On roads, they may not have paid the correct taxes, licensing, or be licensed. I think that's kind of what, I think that's what he was getting at. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, similar, but you're able to sell it as soon as you want, but it's not immediately going to go into the hands of somebody who isn't already on an approved list with other militias and other communities of gun owners.
So I live in Washington State, and we have a law known as I-594 that was passed a few years ago. And what that essentially does is all personal sales are banned. In Washington State now, my wife and I are married. If I sell my wife my gun, Even though she is my spouse in my house, I have to go to an FFL to transfer it legally to her and run the entire background check. Now, I think a way to, as much as I generally disagree with it, I understand the intention. Again, as far as policy, I understand the intention, because that way you are now officially, you're not really stopping any criminal transfers by any means, unfortunately. And it's actually a very hard law to enforce, but it is extra charges for those who do violate the law. So hopefully it's a deterrent. I think that was sort of the intent from what I understand with the lawmakers. Again, I don't agree with it, mostly because it's reasonably unenforceable at this point. But I do understand the intent, right? Like, we want to make sure that this thing, because it's not a potted flower, right? This is a firearm, just like a car. It's something that has a little bit more mechanical parts complexity, as well as public use issues as far as how it's being used, that we want to kind of keep track of, you would think, in a responsible society. So again, I understand that intent. I don't entirely agree with it, mostly on the utilitarian side, that you really shouldn't be tracking it. I don't want the government to be tracking everything I know and own, not just firearms, because honestly, as far as metadata and everything else, it's not their business. But I understand the intent. Like I said, as a policy side, I understand it. I don't agree with it. I think it's kind of bollocks.
Okay, so, go ahead. Go ahead, Elziad.
Yeah, just let you know that thing you mentioned about it being in Washington State only, that's kind of a failure of the American implementation of a lot of gun controls, I feel, in that they tend to do it by relatively small regions, and you can just hop across the state line and have completely different rules and then just hop back, and you've essentially bypassed a lot of these attempts at regulating. Sorry, that was just my...
That's actually incorrect by U.S. law. For somebody who deals with firearms as much as I do, if I went to Oregon right now and bought a gun off my friend without going through an FFL, I've done interstate commerce, which is a federal felony. We actually have federal firearm laws that actually cover that. So out-of-state buying in all 50 states, if we're not registered, if you and I are not residents in the same state, we cannot sell to each other without going through an FFL. So I bought a gun from Colorado a few years ago, and it was a huge, just so you know, getting a rifle that was a gift and paid for in another state, just shipped to my state, was a pain in the ass. And I'm just going to flat out, between getting it shipped, paying the import fees and taxes into my state, something that was already a gift and was technically something already given and owned, was very cost prohibitive, just to import a firearm from out of state. And so again, we do have laws that I think people aren't aware of. And yeah, that's the thing about enforcing, right? Those people like me who stay above board, I'm not going to go willingly break the law, okay? You're right, people can go and do illegal transfers anywhere, but that's not because of US law, that's because they're criminals.
Touche, I'll grant you that.
Cody, how about a new question? Here, now, the kinds of laws that Sean mentioned and such, do you feel like laws like that could have any effect on the violence within, especially inner cities, at all?
Could Sean touch up again about what was about? Was that about the interstate laws and all that?
Sean, could you remind us of that law?
So in Washington State, we have what's known as I-594, and that makes it illegal for any personal selling that doesn't go through a federal firearms license dealer. Okay, so that means I cannot do a personal sale without going through that third party of an FFL. So that we both get our backgrounds check run, all that, all the paperwork happens just on a private party to private party sale. It is illegal by my state's law. And then interstate commerce is illegal without an FFL every time. So
actually, I'm going to ask Sean this. Now you said you understand the law's intent. Could you share with us what you feel the law's intent is?
It's there's the meme, and it's a myth, the idea of a gun show loophole. So anybody in the business of selling firearms it has to have an FFL. So if I buy a single gun with the intent of reselling it, and it's found out at all, I've committed a felony if I do not go get the FFL license, right? Infrequent selling doesn't count. So like selling to family members and friends federally, as far as federal law. However, again, we have interstate commerce lines where I cannot buy a firearm from somebody out of state and vice versa without going through an FFL. And then my state, again, their intent was to kind of chill that idea of backroom purchases, right? The downside is, of course, that these are backroom purchases. That's the problem, right? So a kid in Chicago in a gang area is not going generally to an FFL. What they're doing is straw manning, right? They're finding people above board who are in their gang, like some kid who just turned 18, 21, whatever the age in that area, that has no criminal record and can pass a background check. They send that guy to go buy the guns over time for the gang. That's a known thing. A lot of gangs do straw purchases, okay? And it's very hard to stop that because it takes that one guy who officially is honest on paper, but he's not. Okay, and then he's selling to his gang members and he's getting it to them. That's often how gangs are getting their guns. Like, that's a known thing. So the idea of chilling backroom purchases is great, again, intent, but it's very hard to enforce because the people who are intending to break the law and use guns for violence are not responsible enough members in our society to give a flying fuck what we implement as law. They will find a workaround. They've been doing it.
All right, I'm going to go back to Sean with this one. Now, that's the intent you claim to see. Wouldn't it be more reasonable to suggest that these laws are not to stop these black market purchases, but to make the prices higher than they normally would be and make that prohibitive?
You would think that, but I'd have to find a link. Maybe I'll get it to you. But when they were discussing this in law, we had people debating it in my state, and they've pretty much said it was really to throw extra charges at people caught with straw man. They really, really just wanted to. And Ben, we haven't really been prosecuting people on it because honestly, too, in this area, it's not exactly a huge. I don't think you've heard of massive gang violence in Seattle or the I-5 corridor. It's not exactly an epidemic here. And that's not saying it doesn't happen, but it's not something that's even really prosecuted here. But it is the intent to throw extra charges. That was really what their point is, to chill the effect and to throw extra charges at those who are caught committing crimes. So that was really it. It was hoping to add extra charges to those already breaking the law when we catch them.
All right. Well, Cody, on to sort of a new question. In regards to this kind of violence and such, it's been suggested that America no longer allow 18-year-olds to purchase weapons such as this, but move it up to 21. Do you feel that's fair in the idea that you have to be 21 to purchase a weapon, but you can be 18 to join the military and, hopefully not, but have the chance of dying?
No, I don't think that's fair at all. The idea that being an 18-year-old, you're an adult. Well, you are in the rest of the world. It's 21, isn't it, in the United States that you're legally an adult or something like that? Anyway, being at 18 years old in Australia, in the UK, as far as I know, in the rest of the Western world, it's you're legally an adult. You can live by yourself. You can get a full-time job. You can buy alcohol. You can buy pornography. You can have sex. You can all this other stuff. There's no reason why you shouldn't be able to own your own self-defense. You shouldn't be able to have your own self-defense at 18 years old, especially being that young, especially being that new to the world. It is a scary thing moving out of home into a new neighborhood with people you don't know. It's just a comforting thing to have that backup for you.
Elziad, I'm going to go with a new question here. How do you fight black market guns without stepping on the rights of law-abiding citizens?
Well, funny you should ask that. I came up with my own idea prior to having talked to Holger about options, which was essentially you get legal owners typically fall into a few categories where you've got hunting, home defense, just range shooting, and militias, plausibly. But if you made it so that you had 2 tiers of ammunition, so that you had a regulated supply, which was very well documented, how many bullets were going where, and you could actually track it all, you could have that supply be at regular market price. But say you go into a range You buy 100 rounds, you shoot 80 of them, but then the range buys back the remaining 20 before you leave. So you're not taking those bullets, those rounds out into the market, out into the environment. So that would be the quote-unquote safe ammunition. And then you'd have the loose ammunition. And year on year, you would gradually increase attacks on the loose ammunition, which hypothetically, the things like hunting and range shooting, because they'd be so well regulated, and you could quite easily regulate those, that ammunition, people who wanted to do that could go there relatively cheaply than if they were buying it themselves and then shooting out in the woods just for their own amusement. But they could probably do that with hunting ammunition. But the issue would be is that the home defense ammunition would be constricted at the same time as we're constricting criminal use ammunition. The reason I don't see that as too troubling is because it would be restricted at the same rate for the criminal user and the home defense user. Does that make any sense?
Sean, you got a response?
Boy, okay, so in 2011, one of my pistols, and I keep very good logbooks because that's the kind of boy I am, I had 11,000 rounds on that pistol, just that pistol. Okay. I was still active duty at the time. I was shooting a lot. I was doing some competitions after work as well. 11,000 rounds for one gun that I own. So I don't think you understand how much ammunition is out there, how easy it is to reload. And also, as far as the idea of, in the US, or at least we have the Second Amendment, again, the idea of arms, right? That is both the weapon and the ammunition and sufficient to do some damage, right? The idea to keep arms. Ammunition is involved in that. How much is too much? That's, again, let's go back to individual, right? Maybe you're the guy that wants to get a revolver and only keep a 50-round box of ammo around forever. Good on you. You know, that's a choice you can make. If you're me, and it's not uncommon to do a 350-round range session, working on dot torture a couple times in a row, some 100-yard shooting with pistol, 50-yard shooting, right? I'm going to be burning through ammo. And not just blasting rounds, training. And then if you count that I might be training someone else, right, then I'll be needing more ammo. It's hard to decide that on an individual level because we are individuals. A guy like me has a lot of rounds at any given time. And it's because if I need to run a course over a weekend, I need to have several cases of ammo ready to go so that that new shooter has ammo available that works in the firearm, right? They're not just running around trying to do it all themselves. They're ready to go. You know, I just say, show up, bring your ear protection, eye protection, you know, sensible shoes, sensible clothing, let's get on this. And so I keep it lying around, decent supply at any time just to train new shooters. Not everyone will, and that's okay too, right? So that's why I worry about things like that. It's a broad statement brush that doesn't really get at the violence problem, right? There would be, when you look at murders, and I hate to say this, but we look at the data, okay, so let's say there isn't a lot of guns. It doesn't actually affect the murder rate as much as people think. In general, violent crime in the West has been going down, which is wonderful, right? But your dead is dead with a knife, with a club, with your bare hands, whatever, right? So the murderers are going to murder, right? I am not sure how restricting everyone else's rights is going to stop the murderer, who we know statistically still murdering. And again, society, we're doing something right because overall violent crime is technically kind of going down.
Holger, do you have a response there?
Yeah, I actually have a couple. The first is massacres. This is also a kind of a response to something Cody said. Massacres are a very small number of murders, but they're politically important. Right. I think we all know that Trump, the president, is considering all sorts of gun restrictions right now in the wake of a massacre, and he's doing so in a way that seems more restrictive than anything Obama ever did. So you can see that the massacres themselves hold immense political value, and that's not a good thing. It's actually, if you want to protect the Second Amendment, you kind of have to figure that preventing massacres is, if there's any way of doing it, that's probably the best way you can protect the damn Second Amendment. Because otherwise someone, like some politician like Trump, will be a Republican and he'll see the advantage in in populism, in doing something that seems popular at the moment. And there you go. There's a part of your constitution torn up. So I think that you can see that also right now, because this school shooting has provoked a much larger response. You can see gun channels on YouTube being challenged. So it's all through society that you have to really be looking at these sort of, I don't know, really loud events. So if there's anything to be done in terms of preventing massacres, that's really bloody important in terms of protecting the Second Amendment even. So that was one thing. The second thing was restricting private citizens' rights to bear arms. I think Sean had an excellent point where he mentioned that the AR-15 was an excellent weapon for a 60-year-old lady, whereas a pump-action shotgun was not, right? And I think that, yeah, especially if somebody is in an under immediate threat, then even an 80-year-old lady I hear through the grapevine, if someone is under immediate threat, then the stuff I've been proposing does actually have a downside. If I'm saying you can't have a gun at home unless you've been training with it for 2 years, then that is tantamount to saying to someone who's just come out of a violent relationship, some woman, for example, and she needs a force neutralizer so that she's as strong as her abusive husband, right? Then if I'm saying that she must be restricted, yeah, that's a restriction that applies to a legal citizen. And I don't have a good solution for that, I'm afraid, because there has to be someone or some group or something that says we are willing to be held responsible for the way this lady is going to use her gun. There has to be some way of carrying this responsibility. Otherwise, it's a kind of a free fall. I really don't trust the background checks, if that makes sense. There has to be a community that takes responsibility for the individual.
Okay, Cody, do you have any response there?
What you just said about there has to be someone who takes responsibility. My argument is that it should be that person who takes responsibility for their own actions. It's as fair enough if they're part of a group, of a hunting group. Say you have some hunting group, small ball club, that's there, and they have all their members have their own rules and all that. I just lost my train of thought. Anyway.
So you're saying it's about, personal responsibility.
Yes, personal responsibility. It's the individual who has to take responsibility of their own actions. If they break the law, they get the punishment. I don't see how it's the rest of the world is not like a boot camp. You can't punish the entire group and expect them to bring the other person into line, because there's just too many people, and unfortunately we have a culture of the culture has shifted and people blame the laws for terrible things happening. They blame the gun laws instead of the people who actually committed the crime.
Right, so Elziad, do you feel that personal responsibility should definitely play a role in gun ownership?
Yeah, I definitely do. As I say, ideally, I would want the guns to be much more restricted than they are in their ownership. As I said, I would be in favor of it being that you have to prove that you're responsible before you can actually take a gun home with you. But yeah, basically.
Sean, any thoughts on that? Do you think people should prove they're responsible or be shown to be irresponsible?
Well, that's the beauty of policy, right? We can debate that here and there. I'm a big fan of innocent until proven guilty. There it could be this is where we get into policy, right? like if there was somebody who was known to be incredibly mentally ill, whatever, we do actually have systems in place to deal with this. Florida, to me, was tragic, but as eye-opening to the fact that it actually helped solidify the positions I already held. And that was, the police are not coming. Nobody's coming to save you. You're on your own a lot. Government will and can fail you, because government, just like every other institution, is made of people, and people are imperfect, right? People can be cowards, right? Or institutionally cowards. If in the count of Broward County, that was a leadership failure. Because if it was one officer, it would have been cowardice. The fact you had several officers and it was the surrounding county, the department that responded, then it shows it was a culture in that department that was unwilling to engage the shooter. Okay, and I can say this with...
Real quick.
Okay.
Cody, you wanted to interject real quick?
Yeah. It's a sort of a tangent. Sorry about that, but when talking about Florida and the massacres and all that, about I forget who it was that said it before, saying that it's the perfect thing to get politicians talking. It's how the Americans have gotten Trump to start introducing more legislation about it. It reminds me a lot of Counter Arguments video of Let's Not Politicize This. Fantastic video. I absolutely recommend you watch it. But
can I piggyback something Holger said?
Sure.
That's kind of important. And that these massacres they are politically necessary conversations. That's something he touched on. I agree with that.
Hold on, Cody. Let him finish.
Sorry.
So one thing I agree with that is what most people forget, and as a guy who likes to study crime and went to college for it, Charles Whitman is an interesting case study, right? We didn't ban anything. After Charles Whitman murdered his wife and his mother, climbed up on and barricaded himself in a clock tower and began shooting people. What we did is we got smarter with law enforcement. We didn't have to restrict rights. We created SWAT teams to deal with men like him, okay? That was a smart policy, and we've had SWAT teams ever since. And in fact, when dealing with violent criminals now, we have go-to law enforcement agencies that train people to go handle these people. That's smart policy, right? That is a realistic assessment of the threat without infringing on anyone's rights. We've created a better deterrent, right? Now, if you're going to go climb a tower, you're not just going against, Johnny with his gun on his hip, and that's all he's got in his patrol car. You're dealing with a Bearcat and 8 to 12 dudes kitted up who are half the time prior military who are going to go after you. Okay, that's an important distinction. That was good policy. We've had it ever since, and we know it works. It wasn't knee-jerk. It was a smart policy, and it involved zero restrictions on rights. Instead, it was smarter use of law enforcement. And I think when we talk about policy, that's where we have to think about second and third order effects. Is this really going to save lives, or is it just going to make us feel good? SWAT teams save lives. They don't always even make us feel good, but they save lives. They were smart policy, and they were a direct result of an actual massacre.
Holder, do you have a response here?
Yeah, I do. I agree completely with Sean that second and third order effects are where it's at. And I think right now, most of the propositions that are being put forward by the left in the United States, I think they are feel-good, in the feel-good category. I don't think they'll do diddly. And the reason is they're going to clamp down so hard that they're just going to make a black market, and then you've gone nowhere. It has to be that all of the people who are qualified to have weapons and want them, all of them can actually get them. It can't be any less, and it has to be all of the people who shouldn't have weapon, all of those who are antisocial, I believe. We want those not to have them. That's the only way you eliminate the black markets. That's the only way you make sure that things are under control. So that's the second and third order effects that are really coming into play there. One of the things that occurs to me, right, is that if you have the situation with the woman who needs a gun because she has a violent ex-husband, perhaps there would be a way of saying she can have 15 bullets and a magazine and an AR-15. I don't know, some sort of emergency kit that's really limited, really sort of surgical. Because if she has no training, there's no way she's gonna, become an expert marksman with that weapon, right? There's actually no risk there. So you could imagine that there's some sort of band-aid solution for people who just really need something to defend themselves, and then that could be almost outside of the people who want to carry guns, who want to own guns, who want to be dangerous, but who want to also abide the law because they are good boys, just like Sean, right? They keep control even of how many bullets they've shot through their pistols. Right? If it's like, those gun owners, we obviously want having weapons. So the whole thing is, right, and Cody mentioned, right, the individual has to be responsible. That's actually perversely almost my point. I want the groups to incentivize individuals being responsible. That's also the whole point of laws, right? Laws are there because they make individuals behave responsibly, right? So you have to somehow pressure the individual to become a responsible person, and that's why I have these, hunting group, militia, shooting range community ideas, because there's a social community that is molding people to be responsible agents. I hope that sort of answers most of the questions that are open right now.
Sure, that's fair enough. We have a question in chat for Elziad here. It's from Bethany Davis yet again. Elziad, how would the militia not become politicized? You figured it would be a block and it could become a voting block. So how exactly would the militia not become politicized?
Well, you see, I think it very may well do, but I don't necessarily see that as an issue. In the same way that the NRA is already a voting bloc, the military is a voting bloc. Well, I don't know if it is a voting bloc, although I dare say they're probably more likely to be patriotic than your average citizen.
Are you saying that Democrats aren't patriotic?
No, I'm not, but...
So just to look up this number, because I was curious myself, it was about 60... wow, it was actually only 25% of the military voted for Hillary Clinton, it looks like. Which is 75% of the military for supporting Trump is, yeah, that's a big voting block. So how would you prevent that in a militia?
Well, my question is, why would you need to? It's still a militia, as with the government, as with the military, they're all made up of individuals. These individuals have their politics. It doesn't matter if they're in a militia or not. Those individuals still have their same politics.
That's correct. He's actually very correct on that. I met several Democrats while on active duty Marine Corps. They exist. I'm just saying they absolutely exist. I would not count myself upon one of them because I'm a bit of a libertarian, but they exist. People do kind of maintain their politics, whether or not they're more patriotic. We definitely had the blue-red split across the military. Hillary was just a very unpopular candidate. I think people forget how awful she was as a candidate. That had a lot to do with her disdain by military members. And or Benghazi.
Yes, well, they did notice in 2012 there was definitely less of a split. So if you look at here, and I pulled up the data, okay, in the military, the 2000 election, it was 44 Gore, 54 Bush. By 2012, it was 51 Romney, 47 Obama. So by 2012, it shrunk. You can see it over time. From the height of 56. So yeah, 75% for Trump was maybe more of a reflection of the unpopularity of Hillary Clinton as a candidate amongst the military.
Absolutely.
Maybe because she was definitely more of a war hawk. Holger, I'm going to ask you the same question here. Do you see it as a problem if militias or these community groups you mentioned would become voting blocs? Do you see that as a problem or almost necessary for a democracy?
I think it could be. Denmark has a militia. It's called the Home Guard, and it's associated directly with the military, but it is composed of citizens, civilians, right? So that is composed of 15,000 active duty members and I think 30,000 passive duty, like a reserve. Compare that to the size of our police force, that's 10,000 people. And our population is 5.5 million. So, you know, you could probably expect all of those to be even proportionally a factor of 10 larger in the United States, because you guys like your guns. But I don't think that's necessarily going to be a big, you know, a big issue. It's actually fine. I even think, like in Denmark, the militia is governed by the state because it's just easier. We're a small nation. It's generally, and there's high trust here, so we know we're not going to fuck each other over, because we've learned to just trust one another by not doing that for long enough. I think in the United States you couldn't necessarily have a militia tied too closely to the government, precisely because it would be a check on it, which I think it technically is here. If there was a coup tomorrow, I think the military would just lean back and let the Home Guard take it, because the militia would have democratic legitimacy, because it would be made up of civilians. And as you can hear, the police force is, tiny by comparison to the militia, so it would just be fine. So I think that, in terms of that whole angle, God, I even forget the question. Did I answer the question properly?
I believe you answered it properly.
All right, good.
So Cody, we have a new question for Cody here. Now, is an official quote unquote well-regulated militia possible today in the age of foreign conflicts and America as an imperialist power? Is that really possible to have some sort of militia to replace a government military?
That's a tough question. I'm not sure if I know the answer to that.
Could we hand it to Sean then?
Well, in Australia, in Australia, we don't have a militia that I know of. It's the military and the reserves, and that's it for us. The first I ever heard of the word militia was when I started looking into the United States and what they're on about. But it seems a bit redundant to me that having a militia that is to protect the citizens to be sanctioned and regulated by the government. Because at that point, is it not just another branch of the military instead of being of the citizens?
Sean, do you have a response to that? And the same question, is a well-regulated militia something that could work in an official capacity within the United States?
Well, we have that. That's what the National Guard is as far as the well-regulated part. And then there was the Militia Acts. There were several of those. Then there was the Dick Act, which is part of the Militia Act, which talks about, the unorganized and organized, right? So we do have state guards, okay? State guards, National Guard. And then the idea of an unorganized is literally anybody who could pick up a rifle and fight, a free citizen able to fight. We've actually expanded that. It used to just be, in like 1790, that was just a landowning white male, right? Nowadays, that is black, white, woman. If you are of fighting age, and then you're able to fight, you are part of the unorganized, you're part of the masses able to fight for your homeland. You're able to do part of national defense. And you are counted upon draft numbers and stuff. That's how they process these things. You're part of the unorganized militia. The average law-abiding citizen who hasn't been doing the right thing is technically a militia member, whether or not they think themselves as. They're part of their national defense. You're part of what your nation considers their reserves. And I think what's funny is we don't teach civics, so people have kind of fallen back on that idea, but that is part of a duty of a citizen, right? You're right. If you feel the need to, kill the parachuter coming in on your land, that, if somebody's red dawning you, you have the right to shoot them, right? We're not going to deal with a foreign invader, and we don't have to wait for the military, right? Again, if for some reason red dawn, I'm not going to have to wait for my National Guard. I'm just going to go to my safe and start killing commies, right? It's that fast. That's the idea of a militia concept.
Right. So we're coming up on the hour. So we're just going to do a closing statement from each of you. You have up to 5 minutes for a closing statement. Seeing as this is centrist blood sports, and by the way, go Wolverines, we're going to ask you also insult another member of the debate squad. You got to insult them, and I want you to go for blood. All right. So first up on their closing statement, we'll go with Elziad.
Cody, you're a poopy head.
Oh, blood sports.
Oh no!
Give us a closing statement there.
Yeah, it's been fun. I've enjoyed hearing different perspectives, having some of my misconceptions corrected, and yeah, I mean, it's been good to explore the options. Funnily enough, I don't actually think that we're all that far apart on most of this. Well, obviously we're fairly centrist, but like the pro-regulation side have generally been fairly okay with guns. I mean, I love them. Holger loves them, or likes them at least. So yeah, I think it's been pretty good.
Very cool. So, Cody, your closing argument and insult. You can do the insult after the closing. You can do or you can do it the other way around. Your choice. Go ahead.
Could do it halfway through.
Yes, you can.
All right.
That's how they did it back in Nam.
I've very much enjoyed this so far. It's very refreshing to hear an argument, to be in an argument that is not just screaming at each other saying yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. To actually have policy considerations is fantastic. My entire case is that personal responsibility is paramount, personal freedom is paramount, and they go hand in hand. And I just looking at Holger, your queen sucks, our queen is best.
Ouch. Bloodsport.
That burns, man.
Your response, Holger, and your insult to any one of the other poop heads.
It has to be the others?
I guess you can make fun of yourself, but that's not really blood sports. I mean, that's kind of masturbatory, but go ahead.
All right. Cody, you look like a statue, and you're probably hung like one.
Oh, blood sports!
Now
your closing statement.
Right, yeah. So this is something I haven't really touched on in the rest of the debate, and I really think needs to be remarked upon. All of the school shooters and massacre killers generally are young men that seems to be full of nihilism. They don't have a strong direction, or that direction is extremely antisocial. And I think that there's an opportunity in the gun community to completely reverse that image. I think that of all the sectors of American life right now that has men that are worth aspiring to be like, you're going to find most of them within the gun community. You're going to see men that are generally married, that are generally behaving extremely responsibly, obeying all the rules, even the ones they hate and they like to complain about. And that is an inspiration. That's why I think you take someone like Anders Breivik. I know that case very well. And if you put him for 2 years together with a typical American militia, I think one of two things is going to happen. Either they are going to hate him and kick his ass and throw him, somewhere really dark because he's being antisocial, or he's going to be inspired to be different than what he is. And that's really the strategy I would put forward. If we can build a positive gun culture where people keep each other responsible at first, and then over time people become responsible, you have an opportunity here to use gun culture to end the problem of men who are nihilistic, especially young men who are nihilistic. And if you can do that, if you can provide them with a way of advancing through the world and gaining mastery over something where they can be really proud because they recognize that, should Red Dawn happen, they actually have a role to play. They're actually dangerous. There's actually something good they could do. If you gift that to them, I think you can solve the riddle of the school shooter. Because it's honestly, if school shooters are anything, it is irresponsible gun culture. And most of American gun culture is highly responsible gun culture. So if you have the right legislation in place to promote the gun organizations that can push these young men forward and be inspired, hopefully by older men who are responsible themselves, then you solve it. At least that's as far as I can tell. So yeah, that would be the closing statement for me.
All right, Sean, you're up. You're going to give your closing statement and insult one of these dick beards. All right.
Hi, dozo. Okay, so as I sit here sipping my tea, enjoying the conversation, I'm just going to do the reminder that the last time subjects of the crown advised Americans on what to do with their firearms, we stole a fucking country from y'all. So I'm just saying, we won that debate already. And we won it hard. Holger, I really appreciate your boy. I think there's a conversation to be had with spree killers and massacre killers, and there's a lot of depth, and I studied this heavily in college, and I think this could be a conversation for another time, because there's quite a bit of myth about it that I think is public. That's the doxa, right? That's the public knowledge, but it doesn't bear facts. It isn't only young men. It isn't only disaffected. Unfortunately, and I could show you some evidence of the nomothetic profiles we do have. Like I said, narcissism is usually high, but all the other, the motives and the means even are very different, and they're going to vary by individual, which is why they're so rare and so hard to pin down. As far as the culture, again, I live in the USA, and despite all the myriads of gun laws and restrictions we do have in the United States, gun crime is low. Statistically, especially for how many guns there are, gun crime is low. And for a population our size, we're incredibly safe. And I find that often the media doesn't actually point that out. As a guy who went to school and studied criminology, I live in a very safe country. Everywhere I go, I'm generally going to be very safe. That's what the media doesn't tell you, right? Because fear sells. And there's a whole bunch of media perceptions and myth involving that. And I feel like sometimes that gets drugged. Like I said, there's politics involved in this. But they're not a lot of that is just fear-mongering and ratings. The numbers don't bear out that the U.S. is a gun-filled, violent country. In fact, again, by the murder and statistics, we're pretty chill. We happen to have more gun crime, but not exactly more murders per capita. And there's a reason for that. We just have more guns. But the murder rate isn't exactly skyrocketing compared to the rest of the world. The numbers don't pay that out. And I find it funny when we get beaten over the head as Americans for gun crime, and I'm like, okay, it's still murder. Again, it doesn't matter if it's bare hands, clubs, whatever, or truck bombs. I don't give a shit. Murder is murder, right? That's still somebody who doesn't get to go home because of the actions of someone else. So the means to me are just one thing we need to deal with. And I think the idea of culture and how to foster a safer and more healthy culture is a better debate to have. Means are just one thing, and they're only one thing on the table that people love to discuss, and I feel like they're discussed too much. We don't discuss the rest of it, which is the culture involved. Like, what is a healthy society and what does that look like? That's it.
Well, I think that's a great conversation to have. Now,
War of 1812.
Now I have to, War of 1812. Okay. Yeah, you may have. Okay, stop. No war. Okay. Anyway,
you burned the White House, but you left the 8th and I barracks. I'm just saying, y'all didn't fuck with the Marine Corps barracks for a reason. Think about that.
Word.
Think about it. You left it across the street, bitches.
All right, this has been Blood Sports. Sunday, we're going to have a Liberalist stream. We want to thank you for joining us, and Blood Sports.